The topic of my research is JNK State Forces and the East African Campaign. I will start from my introduction and give you a brief from inside. The annexation of Alsace and part of Lorraine by Germany after Franco-Prussian War of 1870 was largely responsible for the continuous bitter hostility between France and Germany, which carried forward into the 20th CE. Danger of war has already hung over Europe like dark clouds, but its outburst has been long delayed. However, Archduke Franz Ferdinand, the heir to the throne of Austro-Hungarian Empire, was assassinated on 28 June 1914, along with the consort at Sarajevo.
What I told you was,
Yes, sir.
put forward a hypothesis.
No, just introduction and then
Put forward a hypothesis and your findings.
yeah. Sir, my hypothesis is actually, sir, when the war got started, actually they had to plan that the war will only be carried on in Europe and not into the external territories, for example, in Africa. But since Germany and Allied and Axis both had their territories in Africa, so when their war started in Europe, they could not restrain themselves, and they also got into conflict in the African territories also. And actually, Britain had not properly prepared itself for the African battle. So what problem was that the German forces were around in East Africa were around 16,000 in number, and the Germans were 16,000, and British were already around 1 to 2,000 in number. So therefore they had a shortage of forces and they had to call the forces from India. The first thing was that they called up the Indian army, but they had not prepared Indian army properly for the battle. So also along with the Indian army, they also called the state forces, the princely forces that were under the paramountcy. And one of these state forces which they called up was the JNK state forces. And sir, Maharaja Pratap Singh of Jammu Kashmir had made an offer since an infantry battalion and mountain battery for the service under British. While this offer was gratefully accepted, only 1.5 battalion were immediately requisitioned for themselves. And it comprised of about the 2nd Kashmir Rifles, which constituted 50% Gorkhas and 50% Dogra Muslims, and other was the 3rd battalion, which composed of 50% Gorkhas and 50% Hindus. And a small headquarters, and with the new equipment they were sent to Bombay and Deolali, from where they were sent to the East African campaign. And sir, they were all part of the Indian Expeditionary Forces, which were termed as Indian Expeditionary Forces V, which was comprised of the Indian Army and the state forces. Along with the Indian JNK state forces, there were also Gwalior state forces and other from Rajasthan and princely states. And sir, I want to tell you about the composition. In the 2nd Kashmir Rifles, there were 2 British officers and 22 Indian officers. And the total number was 703, including 2 doctors. And the 3rd Kashmir Rifles, which was not sent fully because the British had only called for half. So it comprises of 1 British officer, 14 Indian officers, 302 of other ranks, and officers including 2 doctors. And sir, in this paper I have talked about the 2 main battles. It was the Battle of Tanga and the Battle of Yasin. But I want to say one thing. In both of the battles, the British has lost against the Germany. But my point is, I want to tell you that the British officers who were leading this battle had in their writings, in their letters to the headquarters in London, have talked about many of their forces which were part of this expeditionary force had not performed well. But in case of JNK state forces, they have praised for their loyalty, their battle worthiness, and their fight. And the data I have also given in this, the casualty data and boundary data. In it also there are number of regiments like 2nd Loyal Lord Lancashire, 2nd Platoon Regiment, 90th Infantry, 101st Grenadier, 13th Rajput, 2nd and 3rd Kashmir, 31st Gwalior, 16 Pioneers. In all these, sir, the JNK state forces were in forefront and they had the lowest casualties and lowest killed. And they also, along with that, they have got the highest number of awards for any state forces. And they have performed according to the British officers, those were part of this, as they were better than the Indian state forces. And sir, when they lost in this first battle of Tanga, sir, the British officer commanding has sent letters to the British in the British headquarters in London as well as the British headquarters in Delhi, asking about only the JNK state forces that to be sent to them for the next battle of Yasin. Because the Yasin was strategic point because that area was under first British and German had occupied it. Since the people were, sir, they were very fearful of the Germans, and British thought that if they would reply to the attack of the German, the people would not be so loyal to the British again about the capabilities. So they also went to Yasin, and in this battle, sir, JNK State Forces again performed valiantly and won this battle in the start. In the start, along with the other British Army regiments. But at the end also, in the counter attack by Germans, they lost this battle. But in this battle also, they have performed most valiantly and along with most awards. So I want to make one point. First of all, there has been point made out that the JNK State Forces that it was a very communal force. Okay. But I have already told you that the second regiment was comprised of 50% Muslim and 50% Gorkhas. And the second was that was half in number, comprised of 50% Hindus and 50% Gorkhas. So, and the number of awards won by them. So in the end, I just want to conclude, since I have very low time. So, in spite of fact that expeditionary forces lost on both occasions against the Germans in these two early battles, the performance of some of these units were exceptional, which includes the extraordinary level of bravery and sacrifices made by the 2nd Kashmiri Rifle and the 3rd Kashmiri Rifle. This can be got from the number of gallantry awards won by two units in the lost cause. They performed outstandingly in their first ever assignment outside India in an extremely hostile climate and surpassed many of the regular Indian Army units in battle performance. This added to the already glorious past of JNK State Forces and more such glorious events which were to be achieved not only during the First World War and also during the Second World War. And in the Second World War also I want to tell you that the officer who led JNK State Forces, which was called to be a very communal state, was led by a Muslim called as Brigadier Khuda Baksh. On whose a very famous school is located in Jammu and it is near my locality. So I just want to say that first of all, any state forces, princely state forces were not so meager and weak in front of the Indian forces if they were equipped equally and with same equipment. And second, there are some other views regarding the state forces, but from my account, it is that they were not that communal and they were given equal representation to all the segments. Thank you, sir.
First of all, good afternoon to all of you. The title of my paper is James Todd, Imperial Documentation and Rajput Identity. Whenever we hear the term Rajasthan, then the first thing which comes to our mind is Rajput. It is not like that all the Rajputs live only in Rajasthan or Rajasthan is heritage by Rajput only, but Rajasthan has central place in the history of Rajasthan and vice versa. Rajputs had distinct place in Indian history. This distinct place is partially because of James Todd's historical work, The Annals and Antiquities of Rajasthan. It was a milestone in the historiography of Rajputs and Rajputana. This paper tries to trace out that how Todd represented Rajputs in his work and what were his political imperial motives behind such representation of Rajputs. Colonial mindset behind the Annals and Antiquities of Rajasthan. When we look at the structural context of the early 19th century, then we found that the British authority was in the process of becoming a paramount power, but there were several threats in the path of their supremacy, not just internal but also the external. It was important to have some political and military allies in order to secure internal as well as external security. Todd's work was an attempt to secure both at the same time. To understand it more clearly, it is crucial to analyze the description about Mughals, Marathas and Pindaris, which we found in Annals and Antiquities. Marathas were a strong regional power, and this is why they were one of the biggest hinders in the path of British political supremacy in India. It was necessary to get rid of them, not just militarily and politically, but also ideologically. Politically and militarily, Marathas were all thrown in three Anglo-Marathas war, but ideologically, they were all thrown by Todd's work. Todd used the term territory and predatory operation for Marathas and Marathas present in Rajputana, respectively. On this basis, he proved the presence of Marathas dangerous and illegitimate in the Rajputana. He tried to show the Marathas' invention and presence were responsible for the deterioration of the states of Rajputana. In this way, Rajput was shown indigenous and Marathas were considered outsiders and others. He totally separated the Rajputana on the basis of geography and Rajput identity, in which Marathas were not considered to be the part of the community. Description regarding the Mughal is also crucial. Todd added on the harmonious and cosmopolitan Indian culture. In ancient Rajasthan texts, these wars were depicted as spontaneous war between natives and foreign powers. Toad explained all this communally and term medieval era as the Muslim era. He portrayed Akbar and Aurangzeb as foreigners and Maharana Pratap and Raj Singh as the nationalist rulers. It shows his communal perception. For the external world, he tried to build and present a singular and homogeneous identity of the Rajputs, but internally in Rajputana, he distinguished one Rajput state from one another. This basis of dividing Rajput internally was initiated by Toad only. One can surely say that the Rajputs were not a homogeneous group, but the parameters which Toad used to prove them heterogeneous was problematic. Toad used the conception of the purity of Rajput blood line through. He presented Mewar as superior in comparison of those Rajput rulers who accepted Mughals paramountcy and gave their daughters to Mughal. On the basis of these parameters, Rajputs were divided into several categories. In some cases, we found that Toad's depiction was based on only political motives. Depiction changed as the motives would change, or we can see the changing depiction with the changing political situation. He generally glorified all the Rajputs such as they have the virtues of bravery, valor, but what compelled him to adopt a negative attitude towards Raja Jalim Singh, whom he called a despot, is really interesting and crucial to understand. Jalim Singh was also a Rajput, then why he has called a despot and described very differently from other Rajputs by Toad? The answer is the question lies in the changing political motives of Toad. On the other hand, when conditions go change, then depiction also goes change. When Jalim Singh's power ruled against the British authority, then the pose of praise changed into the pose of despotism. In this way, we can see that the how to intellectually Toad's colonial mindset has worked in his writing to exclude the groups from the empire. In this way, we can clearly see that how Toad's colonial mindset was working behind his writing and how it was keep transforming according to his changing political context. Toad's anti-Japanese thoughts and policies are also an important example of his political ambitions and representations. I have showed in this paper that Toad's documentation is the direct reflection of his political thoughts. His political thoughts were the foundation stone of his documentation. His work could be seen as an instrument for the political policies to gain the support for the security of the British Empire. This colonial mindset was triggered to construct the plethora of knowledge about the Rajput so that British authority could implement their internal policies more efficiently to secure their colonial motives. Thank you.
Good afternoon. I will try to make it short. The topic is reaction of Senate Commission recommendation on the Hill District of Northeast Frontier. When the Government Act of 1919 created the backward track for the Northeast, there was a lot of criticism. From both like the people, both from the natives as well as the British British officers. But it was mainly the British officers who criticized the backward track that was taken to the tribal hill people. And so, in order to overview the whole issue of the backward track, the government, the Simon Commission came to Northeast to study the situation of the hill districts. And during that time, the Assam government, before the Simon Commissions took over and oversees the whole of the Northeast districts, hill districts, the Assam government, they suggested some points to the Simon Commissions. They said like the hill districts and the Assam plains were to be separated because like there was a gap of civilization between the plains and the hill areas. And they also wanted that the Governor General should take over and should be funded by the central government. Yes. Meanwhile, the Simon Commissions, when they took over and when they studied the hill districts and they also visited some of the hill districts to oversee the situation, they came up with a report that like they also see a contrast civilizations between the two. That is the plains and the hill districts. So in the hill districts, they wanted to they came up with this, they came up with the recommendations that the hill districts were to be separated into two: the partially excluded and the excluded areas. Whereas in the partially excluded areas, they wanted to include the Khasi and the Jayantay Hills, and they also wanted the Governor General to involve in the government for the hill areas. When they recommended this Assam government, they were not so happy with the Simon commissions, and they wanted that they had to review a little more on the recommendations that was made by the Simon Commission, and even the Secretary of State in India, they were with the Assam government. But whereas the government of India, they wanted a different form of they were bit of like supporting the Simon commissions, but the other officials like J.H. Houghton and all, they also wrote a lengthy memorandum where they suggested for a separation for the hill areas and the district areas, where they favored like the plants, Assam plants and the hill districts were to be completely separated from each other. And but in the white paper or the common, which was more or less the final result of the Simon recommendations, it agreed on the breaking of the backward tracks into excluded and partially excluded, and that the governor was vested with the power to look overseas the partially excluded areas. And in matters of expenditures, it suggested for non-votable on the excluded areas, and regards to the partially areas, it was to be on vote of the legislatures.
Any questions? What are your sources?
I have some primary sources, and I have used mostly on the
What are your primary sources?
from archivals.
What are your?
Yes, I have consolidated. Yes, dispatch on the proposal of constitutional reforms and all.
No, reactions to Simon Commission recommendations.
Yes,
What are your sources?
Simon Commission report on India, volume 1, 2, and then dispatch on the proposal for constitutional reforms. Yes, I have used on this. That's what I am saying. On the there are so many sources that I've used, so I'm just saying.
Just mention the archival sources.
Archival, it's from the political B numbers, and it's Assam Secretariat. Yes, roundtable conference proceedings and all.
Yes.
It was more of a reaction between the colonial states themselves. There were some, especially in the Khasi Jayantay Hills area, where some natives, they raised their voice, but it was more between the colonial states. No, it was from the sources that I have and from the Simon Commission reports.
Okay, thank you. Can you give me?
My hypothesis is, my paper focuses on the two artworks which are related to King George V, which were done by Rao Bahadur G.K. Mhatre, who is regarded as the first academic sculptor from India. My sources are the artworks, a medal which was done by him during the visit of King George V as Prince of Wales in the year 1905, which is from the India Government Mint, which was earlier known as Royal Bombay Mint, and the statue which once stood in front of Gateway of India of King Emperor George V. Sculptor Ganpatrao K. Mhatre was the first academic sculptor from Western India. He is considered as the most successful early sculptor from the Bombay School of Art, whose studio was located near Girgaon Chowpatty and was later shifted to Vileparle East in Bombay. Mhatre was trained under John Griffiths, the only Victorian painter in British India, At the tender age of 16, he surprised Principal Greenwood of the Sir J.J. School of Art by creating a semi-life-size plaster figure of a Maharashtrian lady going to the temple. In 1896, this figure was awarded a silver medal for being the best model in any category at the annual exhibition of the Bombay Art Society. Later, a gold medal was awarded to the same figure at the Industrial and Agricultural Exhibition of the 20th Indian National Congress, 1904. This image was highly appreciated by painter Raja Ravi Verma and Rabindranath Tagore. As Prince of Wales, George V arrived in Bombay on 9th November 1905 and was received at the Bandar. On 11th November 1905, he laid the foundation stone of the Prince of Wales Museum of Western India, which was built to commemorate his visit. This is the statue as Prince of Wales of George V, which was raised, the first statue to be raised on the Indian subcontinent. And this statue was done by a European sculptor, George Wade. The medal, which is known as Welcome to India, though Mhatre was not commissioned to make the statue of Prince of Wales, he designed a medal for the Bombay Mint. Only the obverse of the medal was made by him. The reverse side is blank. A Maharashtrian woman in Nawari or 9-yard sari, similar to the model of his famous statue to the temple, is observed here as the central figure. So what he made at the age of 16 as the first statue known as To the Temple is observed in the medal. The same model is seen in the medal. Okay. The posture of woman is different from the posture of the statue. She holds here a garland of flowers instead of puja thali and a full of water or an utensil which is used to carry water.
Yes, so can you tell us about the conclusion, findings?
Findings. As I said, my finding is that I have identified a medal which is done by the
What
sculptor.
that you got, that is all the details, the evidence.
Ji.
What are your findings?
The medal was discovered for the first time, sir. And the second statue, I have identified it, which is now in the shade, because after the statehood movement, the statue was taken from the Gateway of India and it was transferred to a shade which lies next to the Elphinstone College. So,
That is your findings?
yeah, I have identified the sculpture as made by him. And these two are related to the two phases of George V, like as a Prince of Wales and as King Emperor.
Oh.
It was the second time that Bombay again got the honor of welcoming the royal couple. The couple was received at the Apollo
That's
Bangar.
okay,
Okay,
details enough.
okay.
You told us your findings.
Yeah, so shall I
That's
conclude?
okay, that's enough.
Okay. Thank you.
My paper title is Jammu and Lahore Darbar, Studying Relationships. So I am finding,
What is your thesis?
this is Maharaja Ranjit Singh wanted to establish friendly relationship with Jammu by calling Gulab Singh to his court. Thereafter, Gulab Singh met him at Daska near Sialkot, and Maharaja Ranjit Singh was impressed with his personality and appointed him as Gur Chakra cavalryman. By 1812, Mian Kishore Singh and Dhyan Singh, father and younger brother of Gulab Singh, respectively were employed in the Lahore Darbar.
नहीं आपका जो है जो hypothesis क्या है?
Sir, my hypothesis.
Hypothesis को क्या कहते हैं?
My hypothesis is based on Maharaja Gulab Singh and his entire family played important role in Lahore Darbar. Yes, sir.
तो इसलिए दोनों दरबारों में जो है
जी सर, friendly relation जी, yes,
एक रिलेशनशिप में
जी
सिमिलैरिटी
जी
है ना?
जी सर.
ठीक. तो आप बताइए एविडेंस बता दीजिए.
Sir, sources.
हाँ सोर्सेज.
My sources, both primary and secondary. My primary sources, Dewan Kirparam Gulabnama, and secondary sources, Major G.C. Smith, History of Reigning Families of Lahore Darbar, and then S.D.S. Charak, Maharaja Ranjit Singh, Rise and Fall of Jammu Kingdom, and Khushwant Singh, the Fall of the Kingdom of Punjab.
So you have only one primary source.
Yes, sir.
And what is your conclusion?
Sir, to conclude that due to the accession of the weak and intrigued rulers of Jammu and unstable political conditions which were prevalent in Jammu, provided an opportunity to sixth ruler of Lahore, Maharaja Ranjit Singh, to fully exploit the situation and conquer Jammu in 1813. Later on, he was so much impressed with the bravery of Gulab Singh, so that he appointed him in his Darbar and also appreciated and lauded his bravery acts. By this we can say that Maharaja Ranjit Singh extended his territory by conquering hills territory like Bhimbar, Rajouri, etc. With this, there was also a rise in the status of Gulab Singh, and he conferred the administration of Jammu on the occasion of his Raj Tilak ceremony on 17 June 1822 by Maharaja Ranjit Singh. Later on, the conquest of Ladakh in 1834 by Gulab Singh, accompanied with General Joravar Singh Kaluria on behalf of Maharaja Ranjit Singh, was very important in the history of Lahore Darbar and also in the history of India, as Ladakh was very important ancient trade route to Central Asia. In fact, Gulab Singh always remained loyal to the Lahore Darbar. He made a lot of service to Lahore Darbar under Maharaja Ranjit Singh. Thank you.
Good afternoon, everyone. The title of my paper is The Right to Mount Sonars in Early 20th Century, Jodhpur Princely State, 1901 to 1946. This paper is an attempt to understand artisanal groups as social entities who were considered lower caste groups and their importance in the economy of Marwar in 20th century. What was the temporal and spatial convergence which made occupational caste more important for state formation in early 20th century Jodhpur Princely State after the advent of colonial rule, and the machines which simplified the production of materials and lessened manual labor. We need to grasp the importance of skilled human labor for the princely state in the 18th century. What paradigm shifts occurred in the early 20th century in terms of skilled labor at the time of colonial paramountcy, mechanization, or the spread of democratic ideas of equality? How things changed in society from 18th to 20th century. In this research paper, I will study the role of artisanal caste in early 20th century and how far the state and artisanal caste were interlinked with each other. How did artisanal caste utilize the state apparatus to demand their newly found social status be recognized and their customs and rituals be changed? I will study in this paper a particular artisanal caste, that is Sonar.
Okay, now just tell me about the sources.
I have used petitions, Sanad Parwana Bahis, and court cases mostly. I have gone through lots of petitions filed by Sonars every year to His Highness Maharaja and state officials. In response to such petitions, Jagirdars and other dominant communities made counter complaints. The dominant sections of society wanted to monopolize all the privileged customs while prohibiting Sonars to observe these rituals in public spaces. On the other hand, Sonars wanted to change these customs through the means of legal procedure. The social conflicts and disputes occurred in society. What was the role of Jodhpur Princely State in order to settle these human affairs? How did the Maharaja and other state officials to whom he delegated his powers of justice dealt with these social conflicts? I have studied the nature of decisive power of king and his state officials.
Okay, what are your findings?
To conclude, artisanal caste seem to have played an important role in state formation since 18th century to generate the wealth of the princely states. The Sonar community as an entity was economically, socially, and politically important in the process of state formation in 20th century Marwar. Skilled manual labor of this community is in high demand in present times as well in Jodhpur region. Spatial and temporal convergence led the Sonars to claim a range of rights that were not always socially sanctioned. The attempt of the Sonars to fight through law in courts that used to take place outdoors at a raised chabutra was fruitful. Through their petitions, they could publicize and advertise their claims, even if these legal proceedings took place indoors, that is in a kacheri or kotwali. The information about the proceedings must have been circulated outside. Thank you.
Good afternoon to everybody. My paper is an attempt to critically analyze and define the three different strands of thought expressed by the higher caste Nayars of Kerala towards movements for the socio-religious and political empowerment of the lower caste in Kerala. The hypothesis centered around these three strands of thought and action shown by the Nayars. And it relies on primary as well as secondary sources. And primary sources, the resolutions, memorandums of the Nair Service Society, as well as those of the backward caste, and letters, news reports. And also I have relied on present works on the Kerala history dealing with these episodes, like those of Perspectives by P.J. Cherian, Tekkumbalam Mohan, NSS Suvarna Grandam, and other works related to this topic. Actually, the Windsor social change touched the land of Travancore by the middle of 19th century. Enlightened rule of the monarchs and often other factors resulted in the rise of consciousness among the lower caste, and you will find a long list of movements led by the Memorial Civil Rights Association, Vaikam Satyagraha, Kallamala Savaram, and the activities led by Srinarayan Iyengar, etc. But in the early phase, I have divided into three phases. I have found three phases. In the first phase of higher caste Nair response, lower caste movements were vehemently opposed. That period was dominated by conservatives and orthodox among the Nairs. Especially in the three examples I showed, the China revolt and the movements of the Ayyangali, and one movement led by Dalit convert Polgil Yohanan, where the upper caste Christians emerged as villains. But in the second phase, I have found that a progressive section rose up among the Nairs of Kerala, and they supported and expressed solidarity towards the people, the lower caste people. In the Vaikam Satyagraha, they led even a Savarna Jada in support of the lower caste movement to enter the roads closer to Vaikam temple. And their leaders, especially the leaders like Manatha Pattanathan, stood for Harijan Odharanam, stood the cause of the social empowerment and religious equality. But when the lower caste movement entered into a third phase, you find they started the movement for political empowerment, especially the abstention movement, which was to expand the franchise rights by reducing the property criteria. It led to a split even among the progressive Nairs. Those who imbibed the Nair caste identity and universal Nair's pride went against them. So my conclusion is that comparative critical study of the history of the struggles of lower caste against caste oppression and social deprivation in Kerala, with special focus on these selected episodes in the history of Kerala, helped us to identify these three distinct phases. As we have seen, higher caste Nairs have shown an ambivalent attitude towards the issue of empowerment of lower caste in the native state of Travancore. A section of progressive and radical Nairs, including K.P. Keshav, Changanasheri, Parameshwaran Pilla, Manatha Pattanathan, Kumbrathuk, Chandapilla, etc., are willing to support the demands for social religious equality as well as the political empowerment. But when the lower caste raised the slogans for a legitimate share in the political power, felt them monopolized by higher caste, and demanded political equality vis-a-vis higher caste Nairs, a section of eminent Nairs who till then had been progressive, drifted towards reactionary path, as is expected from the shifting attitude of Manatha Pattanathan and others towards the issue of political empowerment of lower caste and religious minorities. My conclusion is that when it was the case of political empowerment, it created a schism or split within the progressive Nairs. But on the whole, a progressive section of the Nairs were willing to support the movements for religious equality or social equality to some extent, but they were hostile. A section was hostile to the political struggles for the empowerment of the lower caste. That's my conclusion.
Okay, one question. Who were the lower caste Nairs?
The Chakarat Nair can be included as a lower caste Nair actually.
One caste?
No, there are some lower caste Nairs also, but I have not went into that much detail about the various sections. But I have mostly relied on the concept that most majority of Nairs belong to higher caste. Certainly, some of the castes I know they are included in the OBC Nairs. But at the same time, Nair Service Society or any other Nair organization cannot claim to be representative of all Nairs, as I know. But it is a study to find approaches, different approaches of the Nayars towards the lower caste movements.
Is it politically correct to say that someone in higher caste Christians and lower caste Christians?
Actually, it is not politically, because one problem is that traditionally among the Christians, a section of Christians in Kerala claim to be descendants of the Brahmins, who claims they are converted from St. Thomas, apostle of Jesus Christ. But it is a story, it is not based on any scientific facts. That's why they viewed the converts with contempt. That is the problem. So they claim to be higher caste. One example is they are not willing to send their daughters to marry the Latin Catholics, which is considered as an OBC Christian, other backward caste.
And even in income terms, there is a difference.
Yes, different. They all Latin Catholics and other Dalit converts are included in the OBC list.
Good afternoon, everybody. My research topic is the princely state of Gwalior and a bid to centralize the administrative machinery between 1860 to 1925. My study seeks to examine how a centralized bureaucracy was established in the princely state of Gwalior. My hypothesis is that since the British never defined paramountcy, which implied that the relationship between the colonial state and princely states was based upon negotiations. It provided significant amount of autonomy to Indian princes within their territories and enabled them to appropriate colonial modernity to extend their control and enhance their state income. So, my primary sources are files of Foreign Political Department, National Archives, files of Gwalior Residency Records, again National Archives, administrative reports of Gwalior, and the Gwalior State Gazetteer. So, in the first section, we see that Gwalior administration between 1860 and 1886 was grappling with basic issues of corruption and inefficiency, which was mostly because of the meager allotment of budget for administration and lack of control on district administration. However, the Maharaja Jayajee Rao Scindia never attempted to control the district officials, that is Subas. On one occasion, when Sintoba Temak, the Sar Suba of Malwa, had acquired 9 lakhs of rupees through dubious means, when this information reached Maharaja Scindia, all he did was he charged him with a fine of 1 lakh rupees, but he left the rest of his looted wealth untouched, and he also appointed him as the Naib Diwan in the Department of Civil Justice.
Okay, conclusion.
The conclusion is that as the princely states were a part of the political economic structure of the British Empire, the colonial officials tried to enhance their influence over the Indian princes. However, the princes also made efforts to maintain their autonomy by manipulating the opportunities provided by the colonial state. So the British tried to rationalize the administration of princely estates to make the princes conducive to the British notions of political authority. Nevertheless, the princes also began to appropriate the modern institutions by establishing centralized bureaucracies to extend the reach of their estates. Thus, in Gwalior, we saw that in the first 3 decades after the revolt, political machinery was grappling with inefficiency and corruption. During the minority administration between 1886 and 94, the British officials rationalized state bureaucracy primarily to enhance their influence over the political machinery of Gwalior. When Madhav Scindia assumed the control of the state, so he continued to reform the administration and brought some structural changes to extend his control. The welfare measures initiated by him to provide education and health facilities also raised hopes for the future. However, the reforms adopted in the period of the study also became the basis for stimulating popular movements within the state in the next 2 decades, which shattered the complacency of the ruling elites.
Thank you.
The title of my paper is Agricultural Commercialization and Trade in the Princely State of Jammu and Kashmir. This paper forms a part of my ongoing research, which is Agrarian System of Kashmir 1846 to 1950. My study does not confine the discussion on the agrarian economy to the local context only. Rather, it attempts to study it in the larger context of the imposition of European economic theories in India. It attempts to analyze the complexities of the agrarian system.
Tell me your primary sources.
Sir, I have a lot of primary sources there.
Tell me your primary sources on commercialization.
Sir, do you mean about my region, sir, that I have consulted? Sir, I have used census reports, I have used assessment reports. Sir, assessment reports are primary, sir.
Assessment report,
yes, sir.
What else?
And there are some administration reports as well after so many years. There are
commercialization, prices, wages.
Yes, sir. I have got the price and wages that which deals with the whole of India. It doesn't contain the content on Kashmir. Rather, yes, sir.
On Kashmir.
Yes, sir. There are some local sources, sir, which give the list of prices. Unfortunately, the wages are mostly absent from the sources.
In Kashmir, everybody says Lawrence, Mackenzie.
Sir, Lawrence, yes, sir. Lawrence does provide, but it provides information
something
mostly.
new. Tell me something new.
Sir, actually, first of all, sir, during 1890s when the regular settlement took place, before that the land was not measured. After its measurement, the assessments, new assessments took place, and then we see a flip in the trading activity. And it's also because of the opening up of cart road between Kashmir and Punjab. That's why this trading activity took place in a larger manner. And there was an existence of state monopolies. The state monopolized the grain trade. It also monopolized the trade of other articles which was exported to Punjab and other neighboring countries. Yes, sir. Sir, actually, I had just summarized my paper. I was not reading from the paper. Yes, sir. So the conclusion is that despite the liberation of the market from state intervention during 1890s, one does not find the emergence of agricultural capitalism in the state. The answer has to be sought in the nature of capital formation and accumulation during the period. It's argued that the system of state monopolies, limited internal trade, technological constraints fundamentally prevented the emergence of a proper money market. Besides the over-taxation, occasional jolts to the economy in the form of earthquakes, floods, or more importantly, scarcities and famines restricted the economic progress. Two major factors which were perhaps responsible for the continuance of the subsistence economy was one, the single crop system, which was the dominant feature of the cropping pattern. That's only 5% in the value was under double cropping. And two, the cultivation of cash crops never achieved a preeminent position. Not more than 10% in the whole state was the cultivation of cash crops did not take place on more than 10% of the land in the whole state. Thus, commercialization of agriculture affected not only a small section of the society. These factors possibly explain why Kashmir was a largely non-commercial economy, even till as late as the mid-20th century. Thank you.
The title of my paper is Colonialism and the Princely State of Manipur, Creation of Modern Urban Space in Northeast India. This paper attempts to trace the transformation in economy, society in the urban spaces of Manipur, focusing on the ancient capital city of Imphal. This paper is based on the premises that town and cities are quote-unquote place of contact, where interaction between the colonizer and colonized subject are maximum. Though the colonial policy affected the entire region, the emphasis on this paper is on Imphal, the seat of power, from where the policies, law and policies were further diffused to the state. My sources for this paper is from Foreign Political 1891 to 1922 National Archive, Administrative Report of Manipur, Administrative Report of Public Work Department Assam 1907 to 1920, and Manipur under British administration. This is from 1891 to 1907. Besides this, I've looked into tour diaries of the political agent who served there. Starting from the time of East India Company and later during the rule of Crown, Manipur was central to the British imperial vision of an expansion to east in China. In the course of 19th century, the British had all realized its strategic geographical location as a buffer zone between Burma and between India and Burma. And in 1831, an office of British agency was set up in Manipur as a sign of friendship, and this relationship remained congenial and friendly until the British intervention in the palace dispute in 1890. Manipur was one of the smallest kingdoms to join the list of princely state under British Raj. By 1910, there was about 680 native states, which amount to about 45% of the total area of British India. In hierarchy of princely state, it was given the status of 11-gun salute and remained a princely state until 1947. Immediately after the defeat so my paper tries to look at the transformation that happens after that and focuses on three main things, but I don't think I can cover in this presentation today. First, I look at the spatial transformation. Secondly, I look at the economic transformation with the entry of colonial economy and how new markets were created in Imphal. And lastly, I look at the demographic transformation. However, I don't think I can finish it in this presentation, so I'll quickly look at the spatial transformation that takes place. Immediately after the defeat of the Manipur monarch in 1891, the Kangna fort was occupied by the British troop, and nearby villages were evacuated and displaced. The battalion half of Gorkha rifles were settled in Imphal to confront the further. Okay. So I haven't even started. Okay, so Imphal, as we know now, back in the time, 310 acres of, including the Kangla fort, was captured and was turned into a cantonment. And the area around it was also called the British Reserve, where they introduced the colonial urban development, like it happened in other cities. They tried to demarcate and put in a lot of institutions, and also new markets were introduced, and population from British India were brought in to settle. So my conclusion is that how this kind of urbanism is very scattered and selective, and also because and in that what we call the British Reserve, no Manipuris were allowed to reside. So basically you're evicting the place, and locals were not included. Such urbanism or such urbanization kind of alienates the local population and does not does not allow any hybrid culture to develop. And therefore, even in present day Imphal, the main center, you'll see that there's a lot of segregation based on race and communities. Thank you.
The studies so far on the political struggle has marginalized the presence of food grains in the historical records. This article therefore tries to integrate the correlation between the increasing supply of food grains and the making of a territorial power. The paper will try to present the subtle role of food grains and analyzes the potentiality of it in understanding the historical development. The study makes the usage of archival sources like official publication, letters, treatise, reports, gazetteer and secondary works to have a larger understanding of the process of political formation in the Deccan. The historians have so far stressed on the economic... in the Deccan. The historians have so far stressed on the economic drive of the company that acted as a stimulus behind their involvement in the politics. However, what these works marginalized was how the process of transformation of the company from traders to ruler was sustained. Can the process be understood in the hindsight of military efficiency of the company, or either the skilled diplomacy of the foreigners? What one needs to understand now is that the foreign merchants were not only involved in the trade of luxury items, but it also involved the export and import of ordinary items such as the exchange of paddy, rice, wheat, grains, wines, fruits and pepper. One has to read with grains and formulate the context in which the supply of grains become a critical need among the factories of the company, which sustained its rule in the midst of uncertainties in the Deccan. The region of northern Sakas in the Deccan was highly fertile and productive region in the Deccan. It became the foundational basis for the British to set up its political authority in the Deccan by pressing the native rulers and the Nizam out of it. The control over the production and circulation of food grains has extended beyond the trading group. The regulation over its availability in the market has been often subjected to the orders of political authority. The regulation of the sale or purchase of food grain indirectly specifies the power one can draw from its control. For example, in a letter to William Jayford, dated 10th of July 1681, Lingappa of Kanchipuram mentions the orders issued by the late governors who proclaim that if any person of Kanchipuram tries to lend money or offer to
by any paddy will be punished under his government. This indicates that political authority often try to define the exchange of products in the market. This can be corroborated from the direction issued by the president of the court located in different parts of Indian subcontinent. For example, in a letter, Elu Yale, president of St. Fort George, issued a letter to Mr. John Stables, chief of Visakhapatnam on 15 January 1689. It mentions that the grain is still dearer to us and are receiving a plenty this year in your country. I would like to have you a store by you and pack some of them to ship off from your port to us as it is scarce to us. Likewise, in another letter addressed to William Hustle, Deputy Governor of Madras, dated 21 October 1697, the Governor of Madras asked him to buy and store grain which has come to its cheapest price of the year by taking the money at interest, as the port cannot supply without borrowing, since itself has amounting interest. Food grains likewise formed an essential item of booty in war. The Deccan was occupied with constant battle among the various factions in 18th century Deccan. And in order to establish its supremacy, there are references of orders to make provision for the supply of grains to the troop or to cut off the supply to its rival. For instance, in a letter to Joseph Collett dated 3rd January 1718, it is mentioned by by Samuel Feek that the Moose government has forbade its export. As a result of the price has grown dear at his place. This hints that the supply of food grains were an important tool in the hands of the native rulers to threaten the company servants, who often tried to interfere in its exchange to maximize its profit. Sometimes it was also an essential item to weaken the strength of the rivals by cutting off the supplies of food items. For example, in the letter dated 24 March 1710, our farmer of Port St. David writes to William Fraser of the incident where Captain Roche and Captain Courtney used all kinds of hostility along with 100 men and 200 peons against the Moor. It describes how the burning of paddy and stores of the enemy at their face was the only means to make Sarup Singh hurricane to reason and release the English captives under them. It is no doubt that the availability of food grains were variable to the climatic conditions, political environment and warfare in the region. The constraint on the exchange of grains within the region generated more scarcity and often led the company officials to rely on overseas trade. This can be clearly seen from the voluminous trade in food grains, which can be studied from its export to the ports of Bengal, French settlements, Malacca Straits and Pegu from places like Visakhapatnam, Ganjam, Rajahmundry, Masulipatnam, Madras, Nellore, South Arcot and Tanjore. The letters often mention and urge for the immediate requirement of the provision for the garrison to support the company. The reason to talk for the increasing demand were due to the scarcity of food supply from the hinterland. The scarcity may be attributed to a number of factors. Firstly, to the decline in agricultural production, as the peasants were the ones who were often recruited as soldiers for the war by the native rulers. Secondly, even if we say that the agricultural production did not receive a severe setback due to the recruitment of peasants, then the reason for its hindrance can be seen in the hostile situation of the Deccan, which often obstructed the regular supply of the inland. This indicates that the importance of grain traders in the domain of politics of the Deccan. It ensured a regular supply for the garrison. Thus, the company trade and the commercial activity of the indigenous merchants were often intertwined. The commercial communities and the new merchant class were attracted to the company because in its enclave there was the promise of secure property rights, and for the English company it was a way to sustain their troops and establish their supremacy in the region. Thank you.
Good afternoon to everyone. I will just take half a minute to thank the ILC for giving us this platform. And I'm a new recruit to history. I've started studying history only in the last 4 years of my life. Thank you, thank you. I intend to continue till I am there. Yes, that's true also. The topic of my paper is salt taxation in Bombay Presidency in 1837, a successful experiment. And this heading actually includes my hypothesis, which is that in Bombay Presidency, which the British became powerful in 1818, as we all know, after the defeat of the Marathas. They first tried to impose a monopoly, which was there already in Bengal and Madras, a salt monopoly. And when they did not succeed, they were forced to opt for a different system of taxation, which was the excise duty. They called it an experiment then, and in my paper I try and cull out proof from the archival sources, mainly the Maharashtra State Archives are looked at, and the official correspondence of the collectors, the Governor General, and all of them, to show how it turned into a successful experiment. Now in 1818, when the British became powerful, they had already got shares in many of the salt works which were all along the coast of the western coast, as also on the run of Kutch. So they got their share of the Mughals, they got their share of the Peshwas, and by the time they were already controlling a little less than half of the salt trade and salt manufacture in the western region. But the revenue that they were earning from that was very little. It was just about 3.5 to 4 lakh rupees. So the first thought, obviously, after becoming politically powerful, was to impose a salt monopoly. They made a proposal to the court in 1823, which the court rejected by giving them a lot of reasons like the territories are still unsettled, people will find it oppressive, the cost of salt will go up, salt will become scarce. But probably what they left unsaid was the fact that the Charter of 1813 had abolished the monopoly of trade of the company in India, and there was a lot of clamor against the monopoly. So they rejected the proposal. The Bombay government then came up with an excise duty proposal, which was mooted in 1826, which suggested that instead of the multiple ways in which they were earning a revenue, they would impose a duty when the salt left the pans, and there would be only one duty, and all the transit duties, not only on salt, but on all the articles, would be abolished. So it would sort of become a consolidation of the transit and town duties as well as the multiple duties. Now this particular idea found acceptance with the court, because again there was a clamor for the abolition of transit duties, and they couldn't do it because of the fiscal condition of the Bombay Presidency. Now the court approved this proposal in 1829.
What are your findings?
My findings are, sir, that after the implementation of the excise duty, their revenue improved fourfold. So it was 3.5 lakhs in 1836-37, and it became 13 lakhs and plus in 1837-38, and thereafter it went on increasing.
What was it? The total revenue?
It was still a low percentage. It was about 6 or 7%.
No, in the beginning, how much percent?
Okay, I do not know how much it was in the beginning. It was, but it would have been much less. I have not done it. I'll check
Not
that.
just the absolute number.
I will check that, sir. There is one more thing, that by the 1850s, the revenue from salt in Bombay Presidency had become about 2 million. It was still much lower than Bengal, where it was 5 million. So in Bengal, where it was 25% at the peak of the total revenue, in Bombay it did not cross 9 or 10% at any stage.
9% of the total.
Of the total revenue of the Bombay Presidency. Then the second point is that what made it a success, because the government had actually called it an experiment, and they were very uncertain whether this whole thing will be successful or not. And it's there in the archives, and in fact they kept their options open. Their earlier decision was that their stakes in the salt works they will sell off, because when they are coming up with an excise duty, then they cannot be directly involved in the manufacture and sale of the article. But then at the last moment they pulled back, and they withdrew all mention of it in the law, because by the time with the Charter of 1833 they had also ceased to exist as a trading body. So they purposely omitted all mention of it, but they continued to trade in. And then in 1843 they again said we are willing to sell off our stake if we get proper value, because it was successful. Now I have tried to argue that the two reasons why the excise system became more successful than what the government itself anticipated, there were two main reasons. One reason was that the excise duty imposed was only 8 annas a mount, whereas in Bengal it was 3 rupees. And here the discussions about the excise duty had gone from 1829 to 1837. So during that period, the people would have anticipated a much higher amount, maybe equal to the Bengal or Madras. So since it was lower, plus the duties were abolished, that is the transit duties, so that gave a fill up. The
Thank you.
okay, sir. Thank you. And only one final word. The final proof of the success of the vindication rather, which I call, of the experiment is found in 1853. Because in 1853, the House of Lords, the House of Commons, actually passed an India Bill in which they declared the salt monopoly of the India government as illegal. Now this comment was expunged in the House of Lords, but the government of India decided to extend the excise duty to the other presidencies also. And that's my last point. So that's how it became a successful experiment.
But they still did away with the monopoly.
They did, that's what I'm saying. So I am also saying that the replacement, they found a successful replacement of the monopoly in excise duty. They started with Bombay and it became so successful, although they did not expect it to be, that in 1856 they were able to decide to roll it out into the other presidencies.
Good afternoon. The title of my paper is Administrative Basis for Land Revenue Settlements in the Central Provinces from 1861 to 1900. And I'll take just 5 minutes. The central provinces were constituted for administrative convenience in 1861 by combining two adjoining territories, Nagpur province and the southern Narmada territories as they were known at that time. And at the time of formation of the central provinces, long-term permanent land revenue settlement was a new concept in the territory where people were used to annual or triennial settlements of land tenure that also without ownership of the land. And this paper tries to list out various rules, directives and acts that were used in land revenue settlement of the province in first 40 years of its existence. And some of the legal provisions applied to the province and mentioned in this paper are Saharanpur Rules of 1855 or the Half Asset Rule, Settlement Code of 1863, Circular G of 1865 which was Settlement Code of 1863 in which Appendix 7 was added, Section 6 of the Bengal Act 10 of 1859 used in the central provinces, the Land Revenue Act of 18 of 1881, the Tenancy Act 9 of 1883, the Tenancy Act 11 of 1898 which was extended to the scheduled district, the Land Revenue Act 16 of 1889, the Land Revenue Act of 12.
What is your hypothesis?
Hypothesis is that all the land revenue settlements which were introduced in this province after the formation of central provinces and Barar, that gave incentive to the proprietors to invest in their land holdings.
And what is the evidence for that?
Sir, the various sources which I have
Evidence,
used.
how much money went into
Sir, that I have given the details. That means how the changes were brought in the land revenue
You are saying
settlements.
that they changed the rules leading to
Yes, earlier
investment in land.
Land, yes,
What is
sir.
the evidence for that? Increased investment in land.
Yes, sir. I have to go through in details. Means how the absolute occupancy was not based on any statute, and then how the proprietorship, the occupancy tenant had some statutory base, and then all the sections that are given here. And the conclusion is that the central provinces, just a minute. In the first 50 years of its existence, the central provinces had come a long way from the traditional land revenue administration of the Bhosle rule, in which proprietorship of land was not recognized. Land revenue was settled on yearly basis. The amount payable was declared after nature of crop could be assessed. Different land could be allotted every year, and there were loosely defined various other types of levies on the land. The permanent nature of land revenue settlement after 1860s thus gave incentive to the new proprietors to invest in their land holdings. So,
good afternoon everybody. My paper titled Bureaucratic Recruitment and Subordination of Natives in Colonial Malabar. For this study, I used mainly the archival sources from different archives like regional archives, Kozhikode, then Kerala State Archives, then National Archives. And the reports like the administrative reports of Malabar on different years, and the history of service in Madras, then the establishment list of Madras territory. So, the political authority of colonial state gathered upon many mechanisms like the legal system, bureaucracy, education, etc. for conserving and applying its power, which was necessary for the formation of colonial policy. Throughout the colonial period in India, the employees of the company were recruited from the native populace who carried out administrative tasks, particularly in relation to the collection of revenue and lower judiciary, along with British officials. It made a situation where the British and Indians worked either separately or in cooperation, but the native officers had distinct duties and positioned into a subordinated administrative category under a single government. The subordination among colonial administration and bureaucratic recruitment in Malabar shows the actual character and methods of colonial state in recruiting and disciplining its subordinate employees. Indians were positioned directly or through Indian intermediaries under the direction of European officers. As occupants of the lowest layer of bureaucratic hierarchy, they employed to perform the most menial duties in return for the lowest scale of pay. One can explore the relationship between subordinate and dominant group within the bureaucracy on the one hand, and between state and subordinates and various social groups outside the state structure on the other.
Sources.
I already mentioned this.
What are the sources?
The administrative reports of Malabar, the service books of Madras, then establishment list, then administrative reports of Madras President.
Conclusion.
The subordination of natives was visible from the assignment of their duties and payments of salary to the native officers of European officers. The government paid different amount of salaries to natives and European officers.
Everybody knows this.
Yeah.
We know that in colonial India, the white man got more money than the Indians. So what is the point that you are trying to make?
The colonial state was working with the aim of subordination of Indian colony to fulfill the needs of British hometown and the appropriation.
All that we know. Everybody knows. What is the new point that you are trying to make? Something specific to Malabar?
Like they, in spite of directive principles from their policy makers, the lower ranks of colonial bureaucracy were mainly drawn from the upper caste people. This was chiefly because the Nayars were the first people who get the benefits of colonial education, which were the basic requirement for the appointment of colonial bureaucracy. The Nayar domination in colonial bureaucracy was one of the sensitive issues taken up by the Tia and other backward class elites in their campaign for building up caste solidarity. The series of memorandums submitted by the Tias and other backward committees of Malabar demanding representation in bureaucracy and the deliberation in Madras legislature regarding the statistical data of different castes and communities in government jobs. The very few from backward communities who got education were not considered for appointments on the fragile grounds. In spite of different standing orders, appointments given to failed Nayar candidates, ignoring the qualified depressed class candidate. The consideration given to the nomination made by his assistants, local influence on the of the persons appointed also highlighted. This reveals the strategy of upper class to exclude the untouchable communities from the domains of power. So the subordinate officials, primarily the agents of state and the uninformed embodiment of the state power, were the lower stratum of colonial bureaucracy. So the potential of this recruitment recruitment was seen to have a social and political value beyond personal qualification. The very idea of appointing government officers from different castes and groups affect the hegemonic position of the elites. Those who got jobs in the government service became a distinct class. Though they were placed at the bottom layer of the colonial power structure, they were able to establish the immense possibility of this newly acquired power.
Good afternoon, everyone. Good afternoon, sir. My topic is, the title of my paper is Gandhian Thought in the Bhagavad Gita. And we all know Mohandas Karamchand Gandhi as an extraordinary leader of the Indian national movement. And we mostly know that he fulfilled the national movement's need for organization, leadership and ideology. And we also know the main points of his political thought was Swaraj, the idea of Swaraj, non-violence, Satyagraha, and all these ideas he has borrowed from various treatises, but what I am trying to focus here on here is the influence of the Bhagavad Gita in formulating the political thought of Gandhi. So now what exactly made Gandhi, the charisma of Gandhi, what made him Gandhi, what made him Mahatma was his skill as a communicator and especially his ability to use symbols and images in a language that was for and of the people. So all these ideas that we have, he has tried to use language of the Vedic tradition to give meaning to his ideas. For example, Swaraj for him was freedom in a spiritual sense. So what I am arguing here is that there are certain similarities that we see between Bhagavad Gita and Gandhian thought, in the sense similarities that can be seen in his idea of Swaraj, his idea of non-violence, his idea of civil liberty. In the sense, he feels that the civil liberty is a precondition for Swaraj. So it meant that a person has a social responsibility towards the society, and what a person has to do is that individual has to identify with the society, which means which is primarily taken from the idea of equanimity that the Gita talks about. Equanimity in the sense that a person sees all people as one. There is even temperedness in his thought towards other people. So civil liberty, his idea of civil liberty, equanimity, all of this is taken from, has been heavily borrowed from the Bhagavad Gita. Also his ideal of a satyagrahi can be compared to the sthit pragya ideal that is in the Bhagavad Gita. Even his idea of self-control can be compared. Now the hypothesis is that he can be argued as a critical traditionalist. He drew many core ideas from the Gita which gave his ideas of non-violence, satyagrahi, civil society, etc. But he was constantly stressing on re-evaluation and re-examination of the texts. So that is where I am getting two examples. One is how he is using a violent text like the Mahabharata and the Gita to propagate the idea of non-violence. He does not see the Bhagavad Gita as a violent text. He says that Krishna is not a historical figure. He is used, basically verses 40 to 66 form the core of his ideas in Discourse 2. And he is arguing that the ultimate conclusion of Mahabharata is the fact that it is harping on the futility of physical warfare, and it is only telling us about how a perfect man is supposed to be. So it is not a violent text, it is not promoting violence. So he is re-examining this text and not arguing for violence. He is taking the non-violent aspect from Mahabharata. And secondly, he is not blindly taking everything from Bhagavad Gita. We can also see a contradiction between the Bhagavad Gita and his idea. A contradiction that we can see is between the means and end. So for the Bhagavad Gita, the means and the ends they needn't reconcile, in the sense that the means employed to achieve a particular end. Here in the Gita, it is to basically have the the ultimate aim is to have the dharma, the rule of dharma. That is the ultimate end. But to establish that dharma, to establish the rule of dharma, what is happening is there is a use of violence. For Gandhi, the means were as important, or maybe even more important than the end that is to be achieved, which is why this is the contradiction that we can see. And in the conclusion, what I am trying to conclude is that he is re-examining the text, and he is borrowing ideas but not doing that blindly. And we can also see a contradiction which we can further explore between means and ends, etc. So that's
Respected dais and chairperson and all scholars, I am going to present my paper on contribution of communists in Hyderabad's freedom struggle. I am trying to present my paper according to guidelines of our chairperson. First of all, I present some hypotheses here. First is, state people movement played an important role in Indian freedom struggle. That's why this subject is a very important study here. Communists played an important role in Hyderabad freedom struggle as well as Indian freedom struggle. They worked with nationalist group affiliated to Indian National Congress like Hyderabad Freedom Struggle, Hyderabad State Congress, Socialist group, or some other groups that work in Hyderabad state. They also follow the program of State Congress, Hyderabad State Congress, that was influenced by Gandhian philosophy, like non-violence movement, Satyagraha, etc. And their leader, like Ravi Narayan Reddy, Comrade V.D. Deshpande, they are openly supported this program. They support to Satyagraha and armed struggle, especially in Telangana region and as well as Marathwada. Organization belong from different ideology. They work together against the feudalistic rule of Nizam in Hyderabad state. With other organization and independently, communists work on the front line of struggle and constitute the glorious chapter in this struggle. Communists played an important role to involve farmers, students, workers, and middle class women in this struggle. For that, I use some contemporary writing like Memories of Hyderabad Freedom Struggle. It is by Swami Ramananda Tirth, who is the prominent leader of the Hyderabad Freedom Struggle. Second is Hyderabad Freedom Struggle in Marathwada. It is by Anant Bhalerao. He is also activist in the Hyderabad Freedom Struggle. Third is Jay Prakash Narayan, the Hyderabad problem, the next step. It is forwarded by Jay Prakash Narayan.
What are your conclusions?
And my conclusion is communists played an important role with nationalist group in freedom of Hyderabad state. They actively participate in both non-violence and violent struggle against the feudalistic rule of Nizam. They strongly organized peasant, tenants, worker, middle class women and student against the Nizam.
The title of my paper is A Reassessment of Gandhi's Approach Towards Caste, Varna and Untouchability. I'll begin with the historiography and then I'll Just in brief, one line about the historical, what the common view about Gandhi on caste is. So the common popular belief is Gandhi, he supported the caste system and he was a defender of the Varnashrama Dharma. But now in this paper and this interpretation, it follows from Ambedkar's 1945 publication, what Congress and Gandhi have done to the untouchables. And what recent scholars have done, they have tended to borrow mostly from Ambedkar's writings. The problem with such an understanding is that first the problem arises, they pick up on some of Gandhi's statements and that too from his earlier writings, and second, the context is not elaborated. Third, his practices are not taken into account. But as Bipin Chandra has argued, Gandhi constantly experimented with truth and he changed his understanding of society society, politics and social change. And all his thoughts were in constant evolution. For example, in 1927, in a message to the Sri Lankans, he said that if India has sent you the message of Buddha to this land, it has also to take the responsibility of sending you the curse of the caste system. 1930s, he is saying that caste is a handicap on progress and a social evil. 1940s, it has become an anachronism for him and which must go. So, if you see Gandhi's personal practices from a very early stage in his life, he denounced particular aspects of the caste system. As early as 1881, when he was 12 years old, he challenged his mother that physical contact with Yuka, who was an untouchable, who used to come to clean the latrines in their house, was not a sin in Hindu religion. And at that time, he had challenged his mother that Hindu religion did not sanction untouchability. At age 18, he defied caste restrictions to go abroad. He was outcasted and he refused to perform penance. In South Africa, people belonging to all castes and communities, they stayed in his ashrams. And including the untouchables, they stayed in his ashrams. And he even interdined with the untouchables there. When he returned to India in 1915, Gandhi, he combined political activity with social change. And as early as 1920, he had pushed for the removal of untouchability as one of the essential conditions for his concept of Swaraj. And the 1920 Congress also adopts the abolition of untouchability as an important program of the Congress. So, to come to the aspect of Varnashrama Dharma, that some scholars still argue that even if he gave up defending the caste system, he was a supporter of Varnashrama Dharma. This is what he had to say in 1927. I have gone nowhere to defend Varna Dharma. I am the author of a Congress resolution for propagation of Khadi, establishment of Hindu-Muslim unity and the removal of untouchability, the three pillars of Swaraj. But I have never placed establishment of Varnashrama Dharma as the fourth pillar. You cannot therefore accuse me of placing a wrong emphasis on Varnashrama Dharma. So if you see, if there are inconsistencies in Gandhi's writings, they should be resolved in the light of his practices. Did he practice untouchability in his life? Let's come to, Gandhi says that his forefathers, they had not followed. My conclusion is that while studying this aspect of Gandhi's approach towards caste, untouchability and Varna, you have to study Gandhi in an evolutionary fashion. From the 1920s till 1940s. Thank you.
Good afternoon to all. My paper topic is emergence of communal consciousness in colonial North India, a special reference of women. So, communalism in the United Provinces took shape before the advent of colonialism. This paper attempts to look into the reason for the emergence of communal identity among the Hindu and Muslim women in the United Provinces. Women were victims as well as participants in the process of communalization, which made them conscious of communalism. This paper attempts to study in detail both women participation and religious culture practice of the two communities. In the United Provinces, since both the communities had elite clan, politics was not as divisive as it exists today. Leaders from the two religious groups promoted revivalism of their respective religion, language as a symbol of identity,
identity politics promoted the identity of people. Hindi in Devanagari script and Urdu as a Persian script began to the part of communalization in the United Provinces. Communalism in the it's the most debated issue in India. It brings in many aspects of society which narrated identity, gender, culture and nationalism. During the 19th century, many states were colonized by the Europeans and there was a strong feeling of oneness taking place among the colonized, which this statement by the Gyanendra Pandey. Communism interbred with the nationalism and occupied a majoritarian identity. The United Provinces are historical background. The British ruled the United Provinces during the early to mid-20th century. The coming of the British and the movement of the reviving Hinduism and the Islam did strengthen communism in the United Provinces. In 1856 to 1902, this region existed as two separate parts known as North-Western Provinces, which is divided into Agra and Awadh, were the main region that came under the British. And the United Provinces was took shape in 1st April 1937. Islam. Here I am going to look into how the women were conscious about the communalism. I found some studies in the journal. I'm working on Hindi women journals. So I found some women who were more conscious about the communalism. There's one journal in 1909 which was first published in the by the women. The women were from Nehru family, Kamala Nehru and I'm forgetting the name. This is the Kamala Nehru who were the editor of this journal, Stree Darpan. This journal were focusing on the how the women household women should take care of their child.
Come to the conclusion, please.
So, my conclusion is that cow protection movement and the reconversion, like Suddhi and Sangathan movement, it's a type of movement which made women more conscious about the communalism, which they were started to writing in their private journal like Chand and Madhuri, Arya Mahila. These were the journals where the women were writing. They start to write about the communal consciousness, about how they were conscious about the Muslims. The Muslims, women and Muslims are separate from Hindu community. So,
very good afternoon to everyone. The title of my paper is Tracing the Genesis, the Calcutta School of Tropical Medicine. It is a long paper. What I am doing is, I am telling the sections which I have used, my sources, and then I will be telling about the conclusion on this paper. Here I have discussed how the concept of tropical medicine developed in India, the relationship between race, ethnicity and tropical zones, the crucial question of survival of the colonial power, especially in the places of tropical climate, became intrinsically linked with the idea of race. And then I have discussed the developing immunity and acclimatization of tropical diseases, and the institutionalization of tropical medicine, and borrowing of Indian medical practices and understanding of the dreadful diseases. Especially I have discussed on cholera, smallpox and malaria, and then I have tried to look at how from the second half of the 19th century large part of western and mature delta regions of Bengal were infested with what was popularly known as Bardwan fever, and how these have influenced the growth of an institution of tropical medicine in Bengal. I have also tried to discuss the Victorian imperialism and moral and material well-being of the Indian subjects here, and then the prevention strategies and how this entered into the concept of developing an institutionalization of tropical medicine. I have discussed from the period of the last decades of 19th century to the first 2 decades of 20th century as a crucial era in the history of tropical medicine, and remarkable researches in the disciplines of parasitology, entomology and protozoology enriched medical sciences at this time. It was a period when great importance was attached to the life cycles of parasites and their relationships with hosts and transmitters. It was a time of optimism, faith abounded in the potential benefits of new discoveries. Research works on tropical medicines were carried on both in Europe and the tropics. In India, members of the Indian Medical Service studied tropical diseases and greatly contributed to their control. Under these circumstances, the government looked for private support. Within the Indian municipal system, it was not easy to raise finance for public health through higher taxation. In some places like Madras, the taxes were already very high. In a detailed study of the Calcutta Municipal Corporation, it has been found that the rentier class was extremely reluctant to pay higher taxes for public health purpose. In some places, there were very little or no surplus revenue. In this condition, institutionalization of the Calcutta School of Tropical Medicine came from founding of the endowment funds. I have used the annual reports of the Calcutta School of Tropical Medicine as well as the periodicals of that time, especially Probashi and Bangla Shastro, Chikitshak, Bangla Katha, and how this Bengali periodicals has shown that it is necessary to have this kind of an organization. And I have also discussed in detail how Leonard Rogers was influential in making the institute and how the CSTM, the Calcutta School of Tropical Medicine, developed as a research and teaching institute, and what was the condition at that time, how was the country infested with tropical diseases like cholera, malaria, smallpox and other kinds of fever, and how there were other organizations also which has developed the Calcutta School of Tropical Medicine. There were private initiatives also by people like Kailash Ghosh and etc. I am talking about my conclusion, but I did is in order to consider the pattern of interaction between the colonizer and the colonized, pertaining to disease and health, we need to look at the thought process of the colonized intelligentsia as reflected in the Bengali periodicals and newspapers of those times, how the particular diseases were considered responsible for destruction of the Bengali race. It has been pointed out in the daily newspapers, and the awareness of the Bengali intelligentsia of the visit of Sir Ronald Ross in Calcutta I have discussed, and I have also discussed how the anti-malaria society was coming up in Bengal, especially with people like Rabindranath Tagore as a patron. So this was also a way.
Conclusion in the paper. Can you talk about that? What you have written in the paper?
Yeah, I'm going into it. I'm going into it. However, we have to argue that Western medical institutions could achieve very little for the sake of the teeming millions of India, at least at the time, up to the 20s of the century. They merely served the military and civil populace of the empire and a tiny class of collaborators and few urban elite. The overwhelming majority of the Indian masses still depended on the practitioners of folk medicine and on hybrid works of both indigenous as well as allied medical system. But I have to tell you that this is just part of a total work. This is the work which I am talking about is up to the 20th century, 2020s of the 20th century. But there were changes coming up after that, which I cannot discuss in this paper. Thank you.
The most of the scholars were the opinion that these movements used women for their nationalist ends and weren't concerned with the feminist empowerment of women as such. Women started forming their own organizations from the end of the 19th century, first at the local and then at the national level. For my archival materials, I've used the papers of the All India Women's Conference of the annual reports and other papers basically from the 1970 to 1931, most of them kept in the Nehru Memorial. Then there was in the Young India of the Women in the Vote by the Gandhi, and there are many materials related to the many women leaders of that period, which I have used for that period. So I'll just give a brief description of my paper, and rightly I'll come to the conclusion that women started forming their own organization from the end of the 19th century, first at the local and then at the national level. And the years before independence, the two main issues which took them were the political rights and the reforms of the personal laws. In 1994, we all know that a women's wing was started in the National Social Conference, which was later called the Indian Women's Conference. Later, the All India Women's Conference started branches in the several states in India. This class and the caste bias of the early women's movement impacted the kind of issues taken up for the change. The issues of concerns were those largely impacted the higher caste and the middle classes, such as the widow remarriage, the dowry, the polygamy, and the property rights. Besides, the larger question was always the national during this phase, and if the women's question got addressed, it might have been because it was seen to enhance the larger cause. The liberal ideas of the individual rights to freedom and equality were particularly championed by Gandhi, and that led the foundations of what later developed within the women's movement as autonomous women's organization fostering similar aims of similar determination and independence. I've given my paper of the various leaders in the phases of the 19th and the early 20th century, right from the period, and I included the people who actually formed the movement and how women fought for the women's suffrage and other things, for the Sharda Act and other things, and how they came on the scenes. But I will just give the basic conclusion of my paper relating to it. It is basically the Women's Indian Association, the first women's organization to take the women's demands in a particular way, the labor laws, the demands of the women workers. And as the conference in Gwalior, they started representing and participating in the national movement. Gandhi had appealed for both the Indian and Muslim to join the political movement, and women followed Gandhi because the men folk accepted him as his leadership and emphasizing the self-sacrificing nature of the Indian woman in this process. It did, however, transform the attitudes toward the women's participation, and later in all the period relating to the civil disobedience movement and the Quit India movement, the women organizations started participating. But as women organizations started forming their own organizations and started moving, they started fighting for the women's rights as such. But when we went through this paper and when I was going through it, we cannot say that at that time really for gender justice as such, which I have written in my conclusion also, that in the pre-independent period, the first wave of feminism in this phase had actually started, and it blamed the tradition and religion for this suffering, and they sought redressal in education and legal changes. They were feminist in the sense that they recognized women as oppressed because of their sex. They looked upon women as biologically, psychologically, and spiritually different from the men and based their claim. They argued that women could give special knowledge to all this. And this view fitted well with the Gandhi's view on women and the national desire to bring in the women into the freedom movement. So my paper is just, it expresses on the various leaders and other papers, but since of the paucity of time, we're just putting the conclusion of the part of it, that the first wave of feminism had started, but if we really talk in the sense of the gender justice and all that, in that portions I don't think so. That was really started, but the real momentum had actually started to do with the paper.
The Whole Secretary analyzed the contribution of the BMI in the freedom struggle of the India. She has actively participated in the various political meetings through her organization Anjuman Kaaba. The organization raised funds for the holy places of the Muslims like Makkah and Kaaba. Though this organization, she organized the meetings for the women, where she was advocating for active participation of the women in the struggle against the tyranny of British Raj. BMI had been an active political woman. She has presided the Muslim League session of Kolkata in 1970 in place of her son. She was perhaps the first Muslim woman to have mixed political gatherings of both men and women. BMI was active in Khilafat committee during the Khilafat movement and was presided the meeting of Tilak Swaraj Fund. Besides, BMI has presided a ladies conference at Ahmedabad in which she exposed the brutal face of British and embedded the people with the feeling of... This is the summary of my paper.
No, we don't want the summary of your paper. We just want to listen to the
What do you want to say?
I just concluded in it.
You read out the last phrase. That's all.
BMR told many provinces like Punjab, Bombay, Unit Province and Bihar, non-cooperation movement was going in these provinces at the same place. She infused in people the sentiments of supporting the movement through her exhorting speeches and particularly the women folks for their active participation. Above all her contribution in the national movement, she has raised the two great revolutionary, namely Ali brothers. The sentiments of patriotism and sense of sacrifices were infused in them by their grandmother. Thank you.
Good evening to respected chairman and the distinguished delegates. I would like to thank Indian History Congress for providing me this platform to share my views, also expecting some valuable suggestions and comments for the improvement of my paper. Hypothesis. This paper attempts to trace the journey from traditional birthing practices to the modern obstetrics in colonial Bengal. Its objective is to portray the evolution in maternal healthcare services. For sources, my primary sources are census reports. My hypothesis is to trace the journey, like its evolution, like how did it evolve.
That is an objective, that is not a hypothesis. Okay. What is your conclusion?
My conclusion, I have given like the methods, like slowly it's moving, and the new practices that came into being, and then finally the modern practices like the forceps and all. Can I begin, sir? As you all know, health of women during pregnancy, childbirth, and the postpartum period is termed as maternal health. Though childbirth is considered as a natural mechanism of a mature female body, yet many times the process needs special medical attention due to the complexities that can arise during or after childbirth. With the beginning of the colonial rule in India, changes were introduced in every sphere of life. Maternity health care was no exception to this. Before the advent of the colonial rule, the traditional midwives or dhais used to play the pivotal role in the field of maternity health care. However, this section of women were marked as barbaric for their unscientific practices by the colonial rulers and the newly English-educated Indians. Therefore, in the colonial era, one chief feature of the medicalization of childbirth consisted of replacing this so-called ignorant class of traditional midwives by midwives trained in modern European science. Bengal, being the seat of colonial government, was the first and foremost to experience the changes which came with the colonial rule. From 1870s, reports on infant mortality were published, and the high mortality rate found in this report gained the attention of the reformist class of Bengalis. Hence, they realized the need for reforming prevalent practices relating to maternity healthcare services and childbirth. The Calcutta Medical College was formed in 1835. It laid the basis for institutionalization of midwifery in Bengal. In 1840, with provision for the treatment of 100 women, a laying-in hospital was established within CMC. Lady Dufferin, on the advice of Queen Victoria, in 1885, founded the National Association for Supplying Female Medical Aid to the Women of India, popularly known as the Dufferin Fund.
Okay, thank you.
Good evening, everyone. So, the title of my paper is Durgabai, Early Life, Experiences and Activism. The study hypothesizes that women benefited widely from the freedom movement than the social reform movement, as women themselves took an active part in the former. The study tries to understand women's activism through the study of the Durgabai Deshmukh. In this paper, I try to demonstrate how did individual women change the course of freedom and help construct an equitable society. I argue that in understanding the women's struggle against social evils like child marriages, widowhood, their early lives and experiences provide an important entry point into the understanding of their activism against such evils. So I take this as my entry point to elucidate how different instances during early life of Durgabai helps us understand her activism better. So the sources which I consulted for my paper are basically autobiographical works of Durgabai Deshmukh. However, this autobiography is more or less an institutional biography of the Andhra Mahila Sabha which she establishes. So I try to fill these gaps by using various other sources and other biographical works on Durgabai Deshmukh, including those written by her close contemporaries and close associates. I also use vernacular newspapers, vernacular magazines like Andhra Patrika, Grihalakshmi to provide insights into her life. I've also consulted the oral history transcript of Durgabai Deshmukh at the Nehru Memorial Museum and Library. Also, there is a magazine which is brought out by her organization. So the magazine consists of series of letters written by C.V. Deshmukh to Durgabai Deshmukh. So all this provides me an insight into this. So I look at her family life and family members, how it influenced her thinking towards taking up fight for freedom and women's emancipation. Her grandfather was a close associate of Kandukuri Veerashalingam, a well-known social reformer in Andhra, and Durgabai also continued this association. And her mother, Krishna Venamma, who was widowed when she was very young, and Durgabai was only 13, and she had opposed the kind of sufferings and sacrifices that were inflicted by tradition on her mother. So this was the first time when she was opposed to the kind of sufferings which were imposed on women. And similarly from her father Ramarao, she learned the art of establishing institutions. So Durgabai, who left her formal education in response to the call of freedom from Gandhi when she was barely 12 years old, resumed it only when she was about 22 years. She joined the bridge course at the Banaras Hindu University. She understood the need for such a condensed course for a country like India, and she started the adult literacy program. Durgabai, who was married at an early age and widowed soon after, also refused this arrangement of forced widowhood. She very actively campaigned against such oppression. And with her myriad experiences during her early life, she undertook a crusade for emancipation of women from superstitious customs. And so, as you see, the 1921 marks her entry into the nationalist struggle when she burnt her milkmaid clothes and took to wearing khadi and qadar. She also established the Balika Hindi Pathshala to propagate Hindi language in the south when she was barely 12 years old. And the civil disobedience movement marked her participation in the national politics. So she also served 3 jail terms. Yeah. So through her participation in the jail terms, so she understood how important it was for women to get into the legal field, and hence her entry into the legal field. Basically, through my paper, I try to show how her early life experiences influenced her later life activism and made her do the kind of work she had done all through her life. Thank you.